September 1945. 3 weeks after the surrender that ended the bloodiest war in human history, 23 Japanese women sat rigid and silent in the back of an American military truck, convinced they were being driven to their execution. The canvas cover blocked their view of where they were going, but through the gaps they could see armed soldiers flanking the vehicle, dust clouds rising behind them, and the unfamiliar landscape of occupied Okinawa passing in fragmented glimpses. Every bump in the road sent them jolting against each other, but no one spoke. Speaking would make the terror real. Before we reveal what the Americans had waiting for these women at the end of that 20-minute drive, tell us in the comments below which country you're watching from. This story transcends borders, and we want to know where it's reaching you today. Nurse Keiko Yamamoto sat at the front of the truck bed, her back pressed against the metal cab, gray-blue eyes fixed on nothing. At 28, she was the oldest among them and had been designated their informal leader, a position she had not asked for but could not refuse. Her hands, folded precisely in her lap, showed none of the trembling that seized her chest. She had trained at the Imperial Naval Hospital in Osaka, had served on Saipan watching soldiers die in waves, had been captured by American Marines while treating wounded in a cave hospital as the island fell. She had survived 3 weeks in the detention camp at the converted missionary school, maintaining discipline among her nurses through sheer force of will. But this morning, when the American corporal had barked orders in English she barely understood and pointed toward the waiting truck, her carefully constructed composure had nearly shattered. Beside her, 22-year-old Yuki Tanaka was not even trying to hide her terror. She sat with her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, rocking slightly with each movement of the truck. Yuki had joined the nursing auxiliary to escape an arranged marriage in her farming village outside Hiroshima, trading one unwanted fate for another. She was small and delicate, with wide dark eyes that seemed too large for her thin face. 3 weeks of captivity had hollowed her further. She had asked Keiko that morning, voice barely a whisper, whether dying would hurt very much. Keiko had not known how to answer. Across from them sat Haruko Sato, 35 years old and the only one among them who seemed more angry than frightened. She was a Tokyo-educated widow whose husband had been killed at Midway 3 years earlier, leaving her with nothing but bitterness and a cynical intelligence that cut through propaganda and comfort alike. Where others whispered prayers, Haruko sat with her arms crossed, jaw set, eyes calculating. She had told Keiko the night before that she would not give the Americans the satisfaction of seeing her afraid. If they were going to kill her, she would die with her dignity intact. It was all she had left. Michiko Endo, 26, sat near the back, sketching in a small notebook she had somehow kept hidden through processing and searches. She had been an artist before the war, painting landscapes and portraits in a small studio in Kyoto before being conscripted into nursing service. Even now, facing what she believed was certain death, her hands moved across the page, capturing details. The play of light through the canvas, the profile of the soldier visible through the gap, the way Yuki's fingers gripped her own arms. If these were her final hours, she would document them. Someone should remember what happened to them, even if that someone was only herself. The truck hit a pothole, and they lurched violently to one side. Someone whimpered. Keiko shot a sharp look down the rows of women, and the sound stopped. They had been taught that Japanese women faced hardship with silent endurance, that weakness dishonored not just themselves, but their families and their nation. Most of these women had grown up hearing stories of samurai wives who committed ritual suicide rather than face capture by enemies. They knew what was expected of them, but knowing and doing were different things, and the fear in the truck was thick enough to taste. They had been awakened before dawn, ordered to collect their few possessions and line up in the courtyard. There had been no explanation, just curt commands from guards who would not meet their eyes. The American officer, a tall man in his 30s with lieutenant's bars on his collar, had stood watching the proceedings with an expression Keiko could not read. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either, just watchful. He had said something in English to the guards, and they had begun loading the women into the truck. Keiko had tried to ask where they were being taken, using the handful of English phrases she had learned from the camp translator. "Please, where go?" The lieutenant had looked at her directly then, and she had seen something in his hazel eyes that might have been compassion or might have been pity. He had responded in slow, careful English. "Short drive. You will see." Then he had gestured for her to board the truck, and the conversation was over. Now 15 minutes into that short drive, Keiko ran through possibilities in her mind. Execution was most likely. The Americans had executed Japanese war criminals already. Everyone had heard the stories. Perhaps they had decided nurses who served the imperial military were also guilty. Or perhaps this was about something else entirely. During the war, they had been told stories about what American soldiers did to captured women. Stories so horrible that many Japanese women on Saipan had thrown themselves and their children off cliffs rather than face capture. Keiko had seen the cliffs, had seen the bodies broken on the rocks below. She had not understood then why they chose death over the mere possibility of dishonor. She understood better now. The truck began to slow, Several women noticed simultaneously, and a ripple of tension passed through them. Yuki started crying quietly, tears running down her face, though she made no sound. Haruko's hands tightened on her arms, knuckles white. Michiko stopped sketching, pencil hovering over paper. They could hear the driver shifting gears, feel the change in momentum as the vehicle made a turn. "Keiko-san," Yuki whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want to die. I'm not ready. I'm not brave enough." Keiko reached over and took the younger woman's hand. It was cold despite the morning heat. "None of us are brave enough," she said quietly in Japanese, knowing the guards would not understand. "But we will face this together. You are not alone." "What do you think they'll do?" another nurse asked from the middle row. Her name was Akiko, and she was barely 20, had been nursing for less than a year before the war ended. "I don't know," Keiko answered honestly. "But we will maintain our dignity. We are Japanese women. We are nurses. We have served with honor. Whatever comes, we face it with honor." It was the only comfort she could offer, and she knew it was not enough. Honor was cold comfort when you were terrified. But it was the only thing they had. Might the only identity that had not been stripped from them, along with their uniforms and their freedom and their certainty about who they were. The truck made another turn, and through the gap in the canvas, Michiko caught a glimpse of something that made her blink in confusion. Buildings. Not military structures, but something else. White walls, windows, something that looked almost like gardens? She leaned closer to the gap, trying to see more, but the truck turned again and the view was lost. The vehicle was definitely slowing now, coming to a stop. The engine cut off and the sudden silence was deafening. For a long moment, no one moved. They could hear voices outside, American voices speaking in their incomprehensible language. Footsteps on gravel, the metallic sound of the tailgate being unlatched. Keiko stood, steadying herself against the movement of the truck settling. The other women looked up at her, some with hope, some with resignation, all with fear. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and prepared to face whatever waited beyond the canvas cover. The tailgate dropped open with a clang that made several women flinch. Bright sunlight flooded in, momentarily blinding them after the dimness of the covered truck bed. As their eyes adjusted, they saw the lieutenant standing there, backlit by the morning sun. Behind him, something entirely unexpected. Not an execution ground, not a labor camp, not anything their terror-filled imaginations had conjured during the drive. The lieutenant extended his hand to help Keiko down, a gesture so absurdly courteous given the circumstances that she almost laughed. Instead, she ignored his hand and climbed down herself, maintaining her dignity, then turned to help Yuki, who was shaking so hard she could barely stand. One by one, the women climbed or were helped down from the truck, and one by one they stopped and stared at what the Americans had brought them to. A hospital. A pristine white building with a red cross painted on its side, surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Medical staff in white coats visible through open windows. The smell of antiseptic and something else, something green and growing. Not death, not imprisonment, something impossible to reconcile with everything they had been taught about their captors. Yuki looked at Keiko, her tear-stained face a portrait of utter confusion. "I don't understand," she whispered in Japanese. "What is this place?" Keiko had no answer. None of them did. They stood in a cluster near the truck, 23 Japanese women in ill-fitting prison clothes, staring at a building that made no sense in the context of their fears. The lieutenant stepped forward and said something in English. A young Japanese-American soldier moved beside him, clearly a translator. The translator looked at the women with an expression of profound sympathy and began to speak in formal Japanese. The lieutenant says, "Welcome. You are nurses. You will work as nurses. This is your hospital." The words hung in the air, incomprehensible as poetry in an unknown language. They heard them, but they could not process them. After 3 weeks of terror, after months of war, after years of propaganda about American cruelty, this made no sense at all. Haruko was the first to speak, her voice sharp with suspicion. What kind of trick is this?" The translator relayed the question to the lieutenant, who shook his head slowly and responded. The translator turned back to them. "No trick. You are needed. There are 3,000 Japanese prisoners here. Many sick, many wounded. The American Medical Corps cannot care for them all. You are trained nurses. You will help them. You will help us save lives." "Why?" The question came from Michiko, her artist's eye taking in every detail of this impossible scene, trying to understand what she was seeing. "Why would you trust us? Why would you let us help our own people? We are your enemies." The lieutenant seemed to understand the question even before it was translated. When he answered, his voice was quiet but firm. "We're enemies. The war is over. Now we have only patients who need care. Will you help them?" It was not an order. It was a question. And somehow that was the most confusing thing of all. The hospital administrator's office smelled of coffee and antiseptic, an oddly domestic combination that made the situation feel even more surreal. Keiko sat stiffly in a wooden chair across from Lieutenant James Morrison, whose name she had finally learned from the brass nameplate on his desk. Beside her, Haruko and two other senior nurses waited with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. The translator, Sergeant Ken Hayashi, stood near the window, his presence a bridge between worlds that neither side quite trusted yet. Lieutenant Morrison pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be personnel files. He opened it carefully and began to speak, his voice measured and professional. Sergeant Hayashi translated in segments, giving Morrison time to gauge their reactions before continuing. "I know you have no reason to trust us," Morrison began. "I know everything you've been taught about Americans suggests this is a deception, but I need you to understand something fundamental. We are drowning in wounded and sick, and we don't have enough medical personnel. This isn't charity. This isn't propaganda. This is desperate necessity dressed up as humanitarianism." The brutal honesty of this statement caught Keiko off guard. She had expected either cruelty or false kindness. This pragmatic frankness was somehow more believable than either extreme. Morrison continued. "You were trained at some of the best medical facilities in Japan. You have experience we desperately need, especially with Japanese patients who don't trust American doctors, won't speak English, and sometimes refuse treatment rather than accept help from us." He paused, letting that sink in. "You can save your own countrymen. That's what I'm offering. Not freedom. You're still prisoners of war. But purpose. The ability to practice your profession. The chance to do what you were trained to do." Haruko leaned forward, her voice cutting. "And what do you get from this arrangement, Lieutenant? Surely you don't expect us to believe this is purely for our benefit, or even for the benefit of our patients." Morrison met her gaze directly. "We get a functional medical facility. We get better outcomes for prisoners, which means fewer deaths, fewer international incidents, fewer complications when repatriation begins. We get experience in how to manage post-war medical care in occupied territories. And," he hesitated, then continued, "we get the chance to prove that Americans are not the demons your government told you we were. That matters too, though I'm sure you find that naive." "I find it suspicious," Haruko replied flatly. "Good," Morrison said, surprising her. "Suspicion keeps you alert. Suspicion means you're thinking critically. I don't want blind obedience. I want skilled nurses who will question bad orders and think for themselves. That's how good medicine works." Keiko spoke for the first time, her English halting but understandable. "You lose brother, Pearl Harbor, Sergeant tell us yesterday." Morrison's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, my younger brother David. He was 19, stationed on the USS Arizona." "Then why?" Keiko pressed. "Why you choose this? Why not hate?" The question hung between them, translated and retranslated in the silence that followed. Morrison looked down at his hands, then back up at Keiko. "Because hating doesn't bring him back. Because David wanted to be a doctor before the war. He wrote me letters about how he was going to open a clinic in our hometown, treat everyone regardless of their ability to pay. He believed in healing." Morrison's voice remained steady, but something in his eyes suggested the effort that steadiness required. "This facility, this work, it's not about forgetting him. It's about honoring what he believed in. He didn't die so I could spend the rest of my life hating. He died because diplomatic failures and nationalist fervor and 1,000 political miscalculations led to war. The only way to honor him is to do better in the aftermath." The room was silent except for the distant sound of hospital activity filtering through the windows. Finally, Haruko spoke again, her voice less sharp than before. "You said we would be paid. In what? Occupation script? Worthless paper? Script that can be used at the camp exchange for personal items. Soap, paper, pencils, whatever small things might make your lives more bearable? It's not much. It's not fair compensation for your skills, but it's what I can offer within military regulations. And our movements? Our freedom? Within hospital grounds, you can move freely. Beyond that, you're still POWs and subject to guard presence and restrictions. I can't change that. What I can change is how you're treated within this facility. You will work alongside American nurses, not beneath them. You will have access to medical supplies and resources. You will be consulted on treatment plans for Japanese patients. Your medical expertise will be respected." Michiko, who had been silent until now, asked quietly, "What if we refuse? What if we choose not to work?" Morrison closed the folder carefully. "Then you return to the detention camp. You sit in barracks doing nothing while your countrymen die of preventable illnesses because we don't have enough staff to care for them properly. That's your right as prisoners. I won't force you, but I'm hoping your commitment to healing is stronger than your hatred of us." It was a calculated statement, almost a challenge, and Keiko felt its weight. He was right. And that infuriated her. They were nurses. They had taken oaths, however different the Japanese versions might be from American ones. They had dedicated years to learning how to preserve life. Could they really sit idle while people died simply because the available help came from former enemies? "We need to discuss this among ourselves," Keiko said finally. "We need time." "You have until tomorrow morning," Morrison agreed. Captain Sarah Bennett will show you to your quarters. They're basic but clean. You'll have running water, actual beds, and privacy. Tonight, think about what I've offered. Tomorrow, give me your answer." As they stood to leave, Morrison added one more thing. "Whatever you decide, you won't be punished for refusing. That's my promise. And this only works if you choose it." The quarters they were shown to were indeed basic, a large room divided into sections by hanging curtains, with proper beds instead of floor mats, and a communal bathroom that actually had hot water. It was luxury compared to the detention camp, and that fact alone made several of the women deeply uncomfortable. Yuki had started crying again, this time from overwhelming confusion rather than fear. That evening, the 23 women gathered in their quarters for what would become the most important discussion of their captivity. Keiko sat on one of the beds, the others arranged in a loose circle around the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Haruko broke the silence. "It's obviously a propaganda operation. They'll treat us well, photograph us looking happy and grateful, then use those images to convince the Japanese people that American occupation is benevolent. We'd be collaborators." Or, countered a nurse named Sumiko who had been quiet until now, "we'd be medical professionals caring for our wounded countrymen. How is that collaboration?" "Because we'd be doing it under American authority, with American resources, as part of their system," Haruko shot back. "Every patient we save is a credit to them, not to us." Michiko spoke up from her position near the window. "I've been thinking about what the lieutenant said, about his brother, about wanting to honor him through healing rather than hatred." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What if that's not propaganda? What if some Americans actually believe that?" "Then they're fools," Haruko said harshly. "And we'd be fools to trust them." "Maybe," Michiko agreed. "But consider this. We've been here for 3 weeks. We've been processed, searched, interrogated. We've been afraid every single day. And yet no violence, no assault, no torture, just boredom and uncertainty and bad food. That doesn't match what we were told about Americans." "Absence of atrocity is not the same as virtue," Haruko countered. "They're following Geneva Convention protocols to avoid international condemnation. It's strategic, not compassionate." Keiko had been listening to this debate with growing conviction about what needed to be said. She stood and the room quieted immediately. "You're both right," she said. "Haruko is right that this serves American interests. They need us. This isn't selfless. But Michiko is also right that our expectations have not matched reality, and there's something else we need to consider, our patients." She looked around the room, meeting each woman's eyes. "There are 3,000 Japanese men in this facility. Soldiers, yes, but also our countrymen. Our brothers, our cousins, perhaps even our fathers or sons. They are sick and wounded, and according to Morrison, they are dying of preventable conditions because the Americans don't have enough medical staff. As nurses, can we sit idle knowing that? Can we let them die simply because we refuse to work alongside Americans?" "You're asking us to put medicine above loyalty to Japan," Haruko said quietly. "No," Keiko replied firmly. "I'm asking us to recognize that healing Japanese patients is loyalty to Japan. The war is over. We lost. That's reality. Our people need care. We can provide it. Refusing to do so out of pride or political purity doesn't hurt the Americans. It hurts our own people." Yuki raised her hand tentatively like a schoolgirl. What if this is an opportunity? To learn from them? They have medicines we don't have, techniques we haven't seen. If we eventually go home to Japan, we could take that knowledge with us. We could help rebuild Japanese medicine. It was perhaps the most strategic argument made yet, and Keiko saw several nurses nodding thoughtfully. "They're teaching us their advantages," Haruko said incredulously. "Why would they do that?" "I don't know," Yuki admitted, "but Morrison said Captain Bennett would demonstrate penicillin usage tomorrow. Penicillin, we've only heard rumors about it. If we could learn how to use it properly, imagine how many lives we could save when we go home." The debate continued for another 2 hours, voices rising and falling, arguments made and countered. Some women were convinced by Keiko's ethical arguments about patient care. Others were swayed by Yuki's practical points about learning valuable skills. A few remained adamantly opposed, including Haruko, though even her resistance seemed to be softening. Finally, near midnight, Keiko called for a vote. "We decide together. Whatever the majority chooses, we all follow. We don't split apart. We stay unified." The vote was not unanimous. 18 women voted to accept Morrison's offer. 5 voted to refuse. But when the count was complete, the 5 who had voted no looked at the 18 who had voted yes, and slowly, one by one, they nodded their acceptance of the group's decision. So Haruko was the last to nod. "I still think this is a mistake," she said. "I still think we're being used. But I won't abandon the rest of you. We stay together." Keiko felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of tension she had been carrying since the moment they were loaded onto the truck that morning. They had made a choice, not because they were forced, not because they had no options, but because they had weighed impossible alternatives and chosen the path that aligned with their core identity as healers. "Tomorrow morning I will tell Lieutenant Morrison we accept," Keiko said. "We work as nurses, we help our countrymen, we learn what we can, and we maintain our dignity and our unity. Agreed?" "Agreed," came the chorus of replies, some enthusiastic, some reluctant, but all committed. That night, lying in an actual bed with actual sheets for the first time in weeks, Keiko stared at the ceiling and wondered what they had just set in motion. They were about to step across a line that might be seen as collaboration, or might be seen as pragmatic survival, or might be seen as something else entirely. The first tentative steps toward a peace that existed not in treaties and surrender documents, but in the daily work of healing. She thought about Lieutenant Morrison's brother, dead at 19 with dreams of becoming a doctor. She thought about her own brother, killed during the firebombing of Tokyo while trying to rescue neighbors from a burning building. Both young men who had wanted to help people, whose lives had been consumed by a war neither had started. Perhaps Morrison was right. Perhaps the only way to honor the dead was to build something better from the wreckage they left behind. Or perhaps she was being naive, and Haruko's cynicism would prove justified. Tomorrow they would begin to find out which. Outside, the Okinawa night was quiet, except for the usual sounds of a military facility at rest. In the medical wards, Japanese patients slept or lay awake in pain, unaware that help was coming in a form they would never have expected. From their own countrywomen, working alongside their former enemies, choosing healing over hatred, one patient at a time. The truck that had brought them here sat empty in the motor pool, its canvas cover still smelling of their fear and confusion. But what it had delivered to this unlikely hospital was something more precious than cargo. It was possibility. The fragile, terrifying. A revolutionary possibility that enemies could become colleagues, that professional respect could transcend national hatred, that the end of war might actually lead to peace rather than just the exhausted silence between conflicts. 23 women had been driven toward what they believed was their death. Instead, they had been delivered to their transformation. The real work was about to begin. The first morning began with Captain Sarah Bennett demonstrating how to properly administer penicillin to a patient with severe pneumonia. She was 38 years old, with prematurely gray hair tied back in a tight bun, efficiency radiating from every movement. She had served in field hospitals across North Africa, Italy, and France, and her hands showed the steadiness of someone who had performed triage while shells exploded overhead. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of experience, not rank. Keiko watched intently as Bennett prepared the injection, noting the dosage calculations, the injection site, the technique. Around her, the other Japanese nurses crowded close, forgetting their discomfort and their hunger for knowledge. This was real medicine, our cutting-edge treatment that could mean the difference between life and death. Whatever their politics, whatever their fears, they were nurses first, and nurses always wanted to learn. "The key is consistency in dosing," Bennett explained through Sergeant Hayashi's translation. "Too little and you breed resistance. Too much and you risk adverse reactions. You'll need to monitor each patient carefully for the first 72 hours. She glanced up at her audience, her gray eyes assessing. "I know Japanese medical training emphasizes different approaches. I want to learn from your methods, too. This isn't about American medicine replacing Japanese medicine. It's about combining the best of both." The statement was met with silence. The concept of American willingness to learn from Japanese expertise was so foreign to everything they had been taught that no one knew how to respond. Finally, Haruko spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "Japanese medical technique emphasizes minimal intervention when possible. We believe the body heals itself if given proper support. Your penicillin represents aggressive intervention." "And when the body can't heal itself?" Bennett asked, not argumentatively, but genuinely curious. "When infection overwhelms natural defenses?" "Then we use herbal compounds to support immune function," Haruko replied. "Ginger for inflammation, honeysuckle for bacterial resistance, licorice root for abortursurs." "Wait," Bennett interrupted, pulling out a notepad. "Say that again. Honeysuckle for bacterial resistance? How do you prepare it?" "What's the dosage?" Haruko blinked, surprised. You want to know?" "Of course I want to know. If it works, I want to understand why and how. Medicine is medicine, Nurse Sado. Good technique doesn't have a nationality." It was such a simple statement, but it cracked something open in the room. For the first time, several of the Japanese nurses relaxed fractionally, their shoulders dropping from the rigid military posture they had maintained since arrival. If the Americans genuinely wanted to learn from them, if their expertise was valued rather than dismissed, then perhaps this arrangement could be something other than humiliation. The patient Bennett had been treating was a Japanese soldier named Corporal Tanaka, 19 years old, barely conscious with fever. As Bennett administered the penicillin, his eyes fluttered open and fixed on the Japanese nurses surrounding his bed. Recognition sparked in his fevered gaze, then confusion, then something that looked almost like hope. "Nurse," he whispered in Japanese, "are you real, or am I dreaming?" Keiko stepped forward and placed a cool hand on his burning forehead. "We are real, Corporal. You are safe. We will care for you." "But the Americans—" His voice trailed off, too weak to finish the thought. "The Americans are letting us care for you," Keiko said quietly. "Sleep now. When you wake, you will feel better, I promise." She kept her hand on his forehead until his eyes closed and his breathing deepened into something like natural sleep. When she looked up, she found Bennett watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Wow, that's what we can't give them," Bennett said softly. "Trust, comfort, the reassurance that comes from being cared for by your own people. That's why we need you. Not just your medical skills, your humanity." The first week established a rhythm that slowly began to feel almost normal. The Japanese nurses were assigned to different wards based on their specialties: surgical, infectious disease, general medical, psychiatric. They worked 8-hour shifts with breaks, ate in the staff cafeteria where Americans and Japanese sat at separate tables but in the same room, and spent their evenings in their quarters, processing everything they were experiencing. Yuki was assigned to the tuberculosis ward, and despite her initial fear, she discovered she had a gift for patient care that transcended language barriers. Sure, she learned basic English phrases quickly, breathed deeply, drink water, time for medicine, and supplemented them with gentle hands and endless patience. The American nurse she worked with, a middle-aged woman named Margaret O'Connor from Boston, had 3 children at home and photographs of them pinned above her workstation. She showed them to Yuki one afternoon during a break. "My babies," Margaret said, pointing to each photo. "Thomas is 12, Annie is 9, and little Patrick just turned 6. I haven't seen them in 14 months. Yuki studied the photographs with genuine interest. The children looked happy, well-fed, loved, so ordinary, so human. "You miss them," she said carefully in English. "Every single day," Margaret replied. "But this work matters. Somebody has to help put the world back together after what we did to it. Might as well be me." The simple statement settled into Yuki's mind like a seed. Somebody has to help put the world back together. It was the first time anyone had framed their presence here as reconstruction rather than occupation, as building rather than punishing. She thought about it that night, lying in her bed, and wondered if that was truly possible, if people could actually rebuild across the ruins of war, or if they were all just playing at healing while the real wounds festered beneath. Michiko continued sketching everything, filling page after page of her hidden journal with scenes from the hospital. Japanese and American nurses conferring over patient charts, Sergeant Hayashi translating technical medical terms with the patience of someone who understood that language barriers could kill patients. Lieutenant Morrison making evening rounds, checking not just on patients but on staff morale. She captured the awkwardness, the tentative cooperation, the moments of genuine connection that surprised everyone who experienced them. One evening she was sketching in the library, a small room filled with donated English and Japanese language books, when Lieutenant Morrison found her. He stood behind her for a moment, watching her pencil move across the page before speaking. "Those are remarkable," he said. Michiko jumped, startled, then recovered her composure. "They are private," she said stiffly in halting English. "I apologize. I didn't mean to intrude." He moved to leave, then paused. "But I hope someday you'll consider sharing them. People need to see what's happening here. Not the propaganda version, the real version. The complicated, messy, human version." After he left, Michiko looked down at her current sketch. It showed Bennett teaching Keiko how to start an intravenous line. Both women bent over a patient's arm in complete focus, nationality irrelevant in the face of medical necessity. Morrison was right, this was complicated, this was messy. But it was also real in a way that transcended the simple narratives of war and occupation. The turning point came 3 weeks into their work, when a critically injured prisoner was brought in from a work detail accident. A crane had collapsed at the construction site where Japanese POWs were clearing debris, and 3 men had been crushed. One was already dead. One would clearly survive with standard treatment, but the third, a former sergeant named Kobayashi, had internal injuries that would require immediate surgery. Captain Bennett assessed him quickly and made her decision. "We need to operate now. Major surgery, probably 6 to 8 hours. I'll need an experienced surgical team." She looked directly at Keiko. "Nurse Yamamoto, you've done abdominal surgeries before?" "Many times," Keiko confirmed. "On Saipan, I assisted in over 50 major procedures." "Then you're my second. Lieutenant Morrison will handle anesthesia. Nurse O'Connor, you'll scrub in as well. We move in 10 minutes. It was not a request. It was not even really a choice. It was simply what needed to happen, and the assumption that Keiko would be competent enough, trusted enough, professional enough, to be second on a surgery that would determine whether a man lived or died. In the operating theater, under the bright lights, something extraordinary happened. Nationality dissolved. Language barriers became irrelevant. There was only the patient, the problem, and the combined expertise of everyone in the room working toward a single goal: preserving life. Bennett operated with controlled precision, calling out her actions in English that Hayashi translated when necessary, but increasingly translation became unnecessary. Medical procedures have their own language: clamp, suture, retractor, sponge, and Keiko understood it fluently. When Bennett ran into unexpected complications, an adhesion that had not shown up on examination, Keiko saw it at the same moment and reacted instinctively. "Wait," Keiko said sharply in English. "Careful here. See?" She pointed with a sterile instrument at the tissue plane Bennett was about to cut through. Blood vessel underneath. Very close. Bennett paused, looked closer, and saw what Keiko had spotted. "You're right. Good catch." She adjusted her approach, carefully dissecting around the hidden vessel. "Your training emphasized anatomical visualization, didn't it? Teaching surgeons to see what isn't obvious?" "Yes," Keiko confirmed, handing Bennett the next instrument before she had to ask for it. "We call it seeing with the mind's eye, understanding structure before cutting." "We could use more of that in American surgical training," Bennett said. "Too many young surgeons rush in without proper visualization. It gets people killed." They worked in synchronized silence after that, two surgeons from opposite sides of history performing a delicate operation with the kind of seamless coordination that usually took years of working together to develop. When they finally closed, 6.5 hours later, the patient's vital signs were stable and his prognosis good. In the scrub room afterward, as they washed blood from their hands and arms, Bennett spoke quietly. "That was exceptional work, Keiko. I've worked with surgeons who had twice your training and half your instinct. You saved that man's life as much as I did, probably more." Keiko felt something shift inside her chest. Not pride exactly, but recognition. Professional recognition from someone whose opinion mattered, whose expertise she respected despite everything else. "We saved him together," she said carefully. "Your technique and my seeing, both necessary." "Yes," Bennett agreed. "Both necessary. Maybe that's true for more than just surgery." The comment hung in the air between them, layered with implications neither was quite ready to explore fully. But something had changed. They had trusted each other with a man's life. They had worked as equals, as colleagues, as members of the same team. That trust, once established, could not be easily revoked. Word of the successful surgery spread through both the Japanese prisoner population and the American staff. Corporal Kobayashi survived and began a slow but steady recovery, crediting both the American captain and the Japanese nurse who had operated on him. For the Japanese prisoners, it was proof that their own people were being allowed to practice medicine, to use their skills, to be treated as professionals rather than criminals. For the American staff, it was demonstration that collaboration was not just possible but beneficial, that the Japanese nurses brought genuine expertise that improved patient outcomes. The invisible wall between the two groups began to develop cracks. Not dramatic breaks, but small fissures where connection could seep through. American and Japanese nurses started sitting at adjacent tables in the cafeteria, not quite together, but no longer determinedly apart. Conversations began to happen, halting, translated, awkward, but real. Questions about technique became questions about experience, which became questions about family, about life before the war, about hopes for after. Haruko, the cynic, the widow who had arrived determined to give the Americans nothing, found herself one afternoon teaching Captain Bennett how to prepare a traditional herbal compress for pain management. Bennett took notes meticulously, asked intelligent questions, and implemented the technique on her ward that same evening. When it proved effective for a patient who had been suffering for days, she made sure every nurse on staff, American and Japanese, knew that the treatment had come from traditional Japanese medicine, from Nurse Sato's expertise specifically. That night, Haruko wrote in her personal journal, the one she thought no one knew she kept, "I came here expecting demons. I found exhausted nurses who have seen as much death as I have and are as tired of it as I am. I don't know what that means yet, but it means something." The transformation was not complete. Trust was still fragile, progress still uncertain, but something fundamental had shifted. They had stopped seeing each other as categories, American, Japanese, enemy, captor, and started seeing each other as individuals with names and skills and losses and hopes. The war had made them enemies. Then the work was making them colleagues. Time would tell if they could become something more. December 1945. Snow fell on Okinawa for the first time anyone could remember, a thin dusting that melted by noon but felt like an omen. The hospital had been operating smoothly for 3 months, with Japanese and American medical staff working in genuine coordination. Patient outcomes had improved dramatically. Mortality rates were down. Even the most skeptical administrators at headquarters had to acknowledge that the experiment was succeeding, which was why the order, when it came, felt like a betrayal. Lieutenant Morrison called a meeting of all Japanese nursing staff on a cold morning when the improbable snow was still visible on the hills. His face was carefully neutral, but Keiko had learned to read his expressions over the past months. This was not good news. I've received orders from command, he began, waiting for Hayashi to translate. Repatriation protocols are being finalized. Beginning in January, all Japanese prisoners of war will be processed for return to Japan. Medical personnel will be among the first groups sent home. The room erupted in a chaos of voices, some excited, some distressed, all confused. Return to Japan. Home. The word that should have meant relief, but now carried complicated weight. What was home after everything they had experienced here? What were they returning to? Keiko raised her hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted. How long do we have? The first transport ships leave in 6 weeks. You'll be on them unless... Morrison paused, and something flickered across his face. Unless you request asylum and immigration sponsorship. The United States is allowing some prisoners to apply for displaced person status and eventual citizenship. Medical professionals are being given priority consideration. Another eruption of voices. This was not just news. This was a choice. Stay or go. America or Japan. Future in a foreign land or return to a devastated homeland. I know this is sudden, Morrison continued. You have 2 weeks to decide. Captain Bennett and I have prepared recommendation letters for any of you who wish to apply for asylum. Sergeant Hayashi can help with the paperwork. But I want to be clear, this is entirely your choice. No judgment either way. Returning to Japan is not abandoning the work we've done. Staying in America is not betraying your country. Both choices are valid. After the meeting dissolved, the Japanese nurses gathered in their quarters for what everyone knew would be a series of painful conversations. The unity that had sustained them through 3 months of difficult work was about to be tested by individual decisions that would scatter them across the Pacific. Yuki spoke first, her voice small but determined. I want to stay. I have nothing in Japan except a marriage I don't want and a family that sold me into it. Here I have friends. I have work I'm good at. Margaret has offered to help me find a position in California. I want to stay. No one judged her. How could they? She was choosing survival, choosing a future, choosing herself. But her decision threw the question to everyone else. Haruko was next. My granddaughter is in Tokyo. She's 9 years old. Her parents are dead. She's living with my sister, who resents having another mouth to feed. I am all she has of her father. She paused, struggling. But if I return to Japan now, what do I offer her? I'm a 56-year-old widow with no resources, no home, no way to support her. Here, I could work, save money, maybe eventually bring her to America where there's food and safety and a future. So I will stay. Not because I want to, but because it's the best way to help her. The logic was sound, but the pain was evident. Haruko was choosing to stay separated from her only living family member because that separation might eventually benefit that family member. It was a mother's calculus, and it was heartbreaking. Others declared their intentions, some to return, some to stay, each for their own complex reasons. When it came to Michiko, she spoke quietly but firmly. I'm returning to Japan. Someone needs to tell this story there. My drawings, my journal. Japanese people need to see Americans as I have learned to see them. We need healing at home as much as anywhere. I can help with that. I have to try. Finally, all eyes turned to Keiko. She had led them here. She had convinced them to accept Morrison's offer. She had been the bridge between two worlds. What would she choose? Keiko stood and walked to the window, looking out at the hospital grounds where she had spent 3 months learning that enemies could become colleagues, that professional respect could transcend national hatred, that healing was possible even after history's worst wounds. I'm going home, she said finally. My mother is alone in Berlin. My country needs nurses desperately, people who understand modern medicine, who have seen what's possible when we choose cooperation over revenge. Lieutenant Morrison gave me a gift. He showed me that my skills matter more than my nationality, that my oath as a nurse is more important than political loyalty. I need to take that gift back to Japan. We need to build a medical system that serves patients, not governments. I want to help create that. Her voice strengthened as she continued. But those of you who stay, you're not betraying Japan. You're becoming bridges. You're proving that Japanese people can succeed in America, can be valued, can be neighbors and colleagues and friends. That matters too. That's also healing. We each serve the peace in our own way. The 6 weeks passed too quickly. The work continued. Patients still needed care, regardless of political transitions, but everything was now tinged with the awareness of impending separation. American and Japanese nurses who had learned to work together efficiently began to realize how much they would miss each other. Captain Sarah Bennett spent her evenings writing detailed letters of recommendation for every Japanese nurse who requested one. She also compiled medical textbooks and protocols to send back to Japan with those who were returning. One night, she called Keiko to her office and handed her a heavy package. Medical textbooks, latest editions, penicillin protocols, surgical techniques, everything we've taught you. Take this knowledge home. Teach it. Build with it. Keiko accepted the package, feeling its weight both literal and symbolic. You have given us so much. I do not know how to thank you. Bennett smiled, and for the first time Keiko saw tears in her eyes. You gave me something too. Purpose. When my fiancé died at Anzio, I thought I'd never find meaning again. But teaching you, working with you, learning from you, it showed me that James's death doesn't have to be meaningless. If we can build peace from war's wreckage, if we can choose healing over hatred, then maybe all those deaths served something after all. You helped me believe that. So thank you. They embraced then, American captain and Japanese nurse, former enemies who had become colleagues and improbably friends. January 1946. The docks at Naha were crowded with Japanese prisoners waiting to board transport ships home. Keiko and Michiko stood with their small suitcases, and were preparing to return to a Japan they barely recognized from news reports. Yuki and Haruko remained on shore, beginning their new lives as immigrants in a country that had been their enemy 6 months earlier. Lieutenant Morrison was there to see them off, along with Captain Bennett, Sergeant Hayashi, and many of the American nurses who had worked alongside them. Morrison's farewell was brief but heartfelt. You proved something important here. You proved that peace is not just the absence of war, it's the active choice to heal instead of harm. Thank you for making that choice. Thank you for teaching us as much as we taught you. When it came time to board, there were tears on both sides. Yuki clung to Keiko, both women crying. Write to me, Yuki begged. Promise you'll write. Every month, Keiko promised. I will tell you about rebuilding Japan. You tell me about building your life in America. We are both pioneers now. As the ship pulled away from the dock, Keiko stood at the rail, watching the hospital grow smaller in the distance. That white building with its red cross had been a prison that became a sanctuary, a place of fear that became a place of transformation. She touched the package of medical textbooks in her bag, thinking about everything she would teach, everyone she would train, all the ways she would spend the rest of her life proving that healing had no nationality. The commemorative plaque was unveiled on a warm Okinawan morning, 40 years after 23 terrified women had been driven to a hospital they thought was their execution ground. Keiko, now 78 and one of 8 survivors still alive. I stood beside the memorial with Lieutenant Morrison, now Colonel Morrison, retired, standing to her left. Captain Bennett, now Major Bennett, stood to her right. They were old now, their hair gray or white, their hands marked by decades of medical work. But when they looked at each other, they saw the younger versions who had chosen to trust, to learn, to build something new from war's ruins. Keiko had spent 40 years rebuilding Japanese medical systems, training thousands of nurses in integrated techniques that combined Japanese and American approaches. She had never married, dedicating her life to her profession and to the ideal that healing transcended politics. Yuki had become a licensed RN in California, raised 2 children who became doctors, and worked until her retirement helping Japanese immigrants navigate American healthcare. She had returned to Okinawa for this ceremony with her grandchildren, showing them where their grandmother's life had changed direction. Haruko had eventually brought her granddaughter to America, put her through medical school, and watched her become a pediatrician in Chicago. She had died 2 years earlier, but her granddaughter was here in her place, representing the family line that Haruko's choice had saved. Michiko had become one of Japan's most respected documentary artists. Her Healing Across Boundaries series, hanging in museums and teaching people that peace was built in ordinary moments by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. When Keiko was asked to speak at the ceremony, she stood before the assembled crowd, survivors, descendants, historians, medical students, and told the story one more time. The truck ride. The fear, the impossible choice, the transformation. We were enemies, she concluded, her voice still strong despite her age. We became healers. We remained friends. That is the legacy of this place. Not that Americans and Japanese stopped being different, but that we discovered our differences mattered less than our shared commitment to preserving life. Every nurse who trained here carried that lesson forward. Every patient who lived because we chose cooperation over hatred was a victory for peace. She paused, looking at Morrison and Bennett standing beside her. The war made us enemies. These 2 Americans made us colleagues. And time, patience, and daily choices made us family. That is what healing looks like. That is what peace requires. Not grand gestures, but daily commitment to seeing the human being instead of the category, the patient instead of the enemy, the possibility instead of the hatred. The plaque was unveiled, its inscription in Japanese and English. On this site, 1945 to 1946, medical professionals from former enemy nations demonstrated that healing transcends conflict. 23 Japanese nurses and their American colleagues proved that peace is not just possible, it is essential. Their work saved thousands of lives and created a model for post-conflict reconciliation that echoes through generations. As the ceremony concluded and people dispersed, Keiko stood alone for a moment, looking at the building that now housed a medical school. Students passed by, Japanese and American and many other nationalities, preparing to carry healing into a world that still needed it desperately. Someone had once driven her to this place thinking she was going to her death. Instead, she had been driven to her life's purpose. And that purpose? Healing across boundaries, building peace through daily choices, proving that enemies could become something better, would outlive her by generations. The truck was long gone, but its destination remained, transformed and transforming still, teaching new generations that the most revolutionary act is not violence but healing, not hatred but the patient, daily work of proving that former enemies can become something better, colleagues, friends, partners in building the world they all deserved. That was the legacy. That was the lesson. That was what survived when everything else faded, the truth that healing has no enemy, and peace is built by those brave enough to choose it, one patient, one day, one impossible act of trust at a time.